What is going on, everybody? I hope you've been chilling and living your absolute best life. Today, we're going to get into a conversation about policing in high crime areas that was inspired by a clip that I saw from conservative content creator Amala. Now, this conversation caught my interest because it kind of echoed a sentiment that I've heard a lot, which is that we simply need to increase the number of police in order to decrease crime in these high crime areas. However, this conversation is not as simple as that. Now, as a PhD student, I've dug into this topic a little bit and have even written an article on the topic of race and policing. So what I wanted to do was listen to their exchange and then react, filling in the details that I saw as missing from their conversation. So let's check out this clip and see what they're talking about.
All right, we'll now have time for questions. If you have questions, please line up. Given that in the status quo, Black and Latino neighborhoods are being over-policed, would you be in support of divesting away from traditional police forces and into proactive public service programs?
Not necessarily. I'm not into the divest revest thing, and I do take issue with the over policed idea. And this is through just looking into it and anecdotal experience of being in a neighborhood that is often used as an example of being over policed. So when you see a narrative of Black and Latino people being over policed, and then you hear from said people in the neighborhood saying, no, I want more police here. Our neighborhood is being damaged by people who are engaging in criminal activity. Then the storyline starts to break for me.
So in my opinion, she begins by making a really good point. The relationship between the police and the people who live within these structurally disadvantaged and high crime areas is far more complex than mainstream media narratives suggest. However, it is also far more complex than she is leading on here. The first issue that I have is the way that she frames this discussion as the narrative of over-policing. I believe that she frames it this way as a way to delegitimize the people who believe in the concept of over-policing. So we need to establish that just because one party or another uses or misuses a concept for their own political gain, it does not automatically mean that that concept is not reflective of a real issue. In this situation, the issue arises from the logic that in high crime areas, the only way to reduce crime is by flooding those areas with police.
Let's simplify this if we can.
Sure.
If Ben Shapiro is the king of the world, how do you fix Baltimore? How do you fix Detroit? How do you fix the south side of Chicago?
Okay, so here's the unpopular view, but it happens to be empirically correct. The first thing you have to do is you have to load the place with police. You got to load the place with police because you have to stop crime. Once you stop.
However, despite the claims that the effectiveness of this increased police presence is an empirical truth that we are just not willing to admit, what is often omitted from these conversations is that increased police presence also has a host of collateral consequences that bring into question whether the reduction in crime is actually worth it. What this shows is that the issue of over-policing is not simply about the quantity of police, but it's about what they do while they're on duty, what I will refer to as the quality of policing. So to understand the implications of the quality of policing, we first need to distinguish between reactive policing and proactive policing. Now, reactive policing is what most people think of when they think about police work. So reactive policing is response-oriented. This means that the police become involved in a circumstance or situation after the crime occurs. Reactive policing is also incident-driven, meaning that the focus of reactive policing is to address the individual incidents as they come. Reactive policing is also short-term focused, which means that the police are trying to solve the immediate crime at hand. And reactive policing relies on what we know as the traditional modes of policing. This includes things like patrolling, responding to calls, and collecting evidence. And finally, reactive policing is not prevention-focused. On the other hand, proactive policing is prevention-focused. The aim here is to prevent crime before it occurs. To this extent, police try to identify patterns, trends, and problem areas with the hopes of predicting crime. Proactive policing is also long-term focused, aiming at the root of crime, hopefully prevents crime from happening over the long term. Proactive policing also uses a totally different set of police strategies. These include things like community policing, problem-solving policing, hotspots policing, stop and frisk tactics, and investigatory traffic stops. Now that we have a surface level understanding of the difference between reactive and proactive policing, we can dig into the concept of profiling. Now, racial profiling is a hot button issue that I'm sure many of you guys have heard of, but I wanted to clarify some things about racial profiling before we move forward. First, we need to figure out what is and what is not racial profiling. So let's say that a robbery took place. and a witness who saw the robbery called the police and identified the perpetrator as a black male who is 6 feet with a black coat on. If the police receive this call, get the description, and then go into the immediate area looking for a black man who is 6 feet with a black coat on, this is not racial profiling. On the other hand, let's say that the police are generally trying to reduce the number of guns that are being carried on the street in a particular area. Now let's say that the police have developed a profile of a person who's most likely to carry a gun. Now let's say that the profile that they develop is a black male that ages of 16 to 24 who wears a particular type of clothing or drives a particular type of car. Now let's say that they begin to pull people over who fit this description, whether they have done something or not. Now, this would be racial profiling. One of the major differences between the two is that in the first example, it is possible that in searching for a black man who is 6 feet with a black coat on, that a black man who is around 6 feet with a black coat on who did not commit the robbery would be pulled over, but I would consider that an unintentional outcome. In the second example, the police know that most of the people that they pull over are not going to have guns, but they justified the approach because of the small number of guns that they are going to get. Now, a common response that I hear about complaints of profiling or being pulled over by the cops when you haven't done anything wrong, they say something like, look, if you haven't done anything, just cooperate with the police. You'll be fine. And there's also another group who's only concerned with the police behavior when it is illegal. And so since profiling, the way that I've described it, is not an illegal action, then they will dismiss it as non-important. The issue here is whether legal or not, proactive policing affects more than just crime rates. The research shows that there are unintended consequences for these tactics. The first we will discuss is what, in my world, they call a backfire effect of proactive policing tactics. Now, in my world, backfire effect occurs when an intervention is put in place that is meant to have a certain effect, but it actually leads to the opposite effect as it is intended. Now, in the case of proactive policing, the research has actually shown that it can have the effect of perpetuating the very crime it is set out to reduce. Now, in her book, Chosen Ones, Nikki Jones describes the consequences of proactive policing tactics as placing young black men into what she calls a double bind. Now, in this double bind, young black men are simultaneously targets of violence from their peers as well as targets of anti-violence, anti-gang, and anti-crime tactics of the police. Now, Jones argues that the high crime in these areas, coupled with the aggressive anti-crime police tactics, co-create the violence that occurs in these spaces. And this is talked about in kind of like a cyclical fashion. For instance, the violence in the neighborhood spurs calls for more police and more aggressive policing. The larger number of police and more aggressive police tactics leads to more frequent and potentially more aggressive encounters between residents and police. This in turn leads to a delegitimization of the police from the community and a loss of faith. Feeling as if the police have lost their legitimacy leads to a disengagement with law enforcement, leads to less calls to the police, and also spurs more individuals turning to street justice as a way to solve their own problems. Now, Jones's observation has been reinforced by a recent systematic review on the effectiveness of proactive police stops. The analysis from this study shows that being stopped by the police is associated with decreased mental health, physical health, attitudes toward the police, and even increased levels of delinquency. Furthermore, these effects are worse for young people who are much more vulnerable to the negative effects of these encounters and more likely to experience them. And finally, the authors in this study conclude that this may mean that the negative effects of police stops are concentrated within minorities or disadvantaged populations, and that this may further pre-existing socioeconomic disparities and weaken relationships between the police and the community. So ultimately, I think that there is a discussion to be had about how to best respond to crime in many of our high crime areas. It is not a simple problem, and the discussion that I just laid out just points to more complications and not really to any solutions. But I think maybe that's my point. Solving crime in these areas is not as simple as increasing the number of police. I also caution those who are gung-ho on getting tough on these criminals. If getting tough on crime dehumanizes and damages those who come into contact with the criminal justice system, as well as causes collateral damage to those who haven't done anything wrong, then I believe it is legitimate to question whether the reduction in crime is worth the cost that comes to bear. So let me know what you think about this topic. Do you agree with my assessment? Do you believe that I am missing anything? Do you have alternate solutions that you think would work instead? Well, if you do, let me know in the comments section below. Also, hit that like button if you enjoyed this video and want to see more of them. Please subscribe, turn on your bell so you can be notified of my next video. And for all who stayed to the end, I appreciate you, and I will see you on the flip side.